a BBC News special.
Having carefully weighed all the arguments, I've decided that the national interest is best served by postponing these elections until June the 7th.
Tony Blair ends the guessing game and postpones polling day for the first time since the war. The Tories accuse him of dithering and warn they'll oppose a June election. But as more cattle burn, what cost a delay to Britain's tourist trade? Hello and welcome to a BBC News special report on the date of the local elections. And as almost everyone here in Westminster will tell you, when we talk of local elections, it's become a kind of code for the general election. For the first time since World War II, a British Prime Minister has postponed the date of elections, scheduled for May the 3rd until June the 7th. This is how the Prime Minister made the announcement that the fight against foot and mouth disease has utterly changed Britain's political timetable.
In reaching this decision, the three most important factors have been these. First, the impact that any delay and the signal it sends has on our tourism industry and the key national interest in avoiding unnecessary uncertainty for the broader economy. Secondly, the need for national and in some cases local politicians to be focused on the fight against foot and mouth disease as we put in place the machinery necessary to deal with any eventuality. And thirdly, the feelings and sensitivities of the people in the communities most affected. There is no practical impediment to free and fair elections being held, even in the areas badly affected by foot and mouth disease. We're satisfied that the elections could go ahead. The question is whether they should. It is true that foot and mouth only affects a small minority of the country directly, and that it is particularly concentrated in certain areas, as I said earlier. Even within the agricultural community, it is a very small percentage of livestock farms that are directly affected. However, where it has struck, it is struck with a profound and disturbing impact on those communities most affected. Whilst this is going on, I believe it would not be appropriate to hold these elections on the 3rd of May. But equally, we cannot, should not, and will not indefinitely suspend the democratic process. A short postponement, for the reasons that I have given, is one thing. An indefinite delay is quite another.
Prime Minister, well, joining me now from outside number 10 is the BBC's chief political correspondent, Nick Robinson. Nick, how risky is this for the Prime Minister?
Well, it is risky because the Prime Minister is tying his own fate, that of his government and his party, to a disease that ministers simply cannot control, and a disease which they have so far underestimated the spread of and struggled to come up with a coherent package to deal with. And he's set himself a timetable, not a very long one, Gavin, by which he has to have it under control. By saying that these elections will be postponed to June the 7th, come what may, whether the disease is cracked or not cracked, he is giving himself just a matter of a few weeks over the Easter period to sort this out. If he doesn't, as many Labour MPs fear, the calls to postpone will come again, and the calls will come once more that he is putting party before country, a charge he hoped he'd remove by making this postponement today.
Even though he didn't say this, are we now in effect at the beginning of a 10-week general election campaign? And isn't there a risk for his party, where apathy is always a big problem, that people just get fed up with politicians?
Well, he didn't say it because he can't say it, because to announce the general election would invite civil servants to down tools. They have to be politically neutral. When a Prime Minister announces an election, they basically give up the work for ministers other than those crucial tasks necessary to keep the country running. He doesn't want that. He wants to retain the powers of government, and he wants to push business through the Commons and the Lords. And yes, of course, there is a danger that people get bored. Now, I think the Labour Party will try and shorten this campaign, focus on foot and mouth now, allow the election campaign to start after Easter, not before. But if the Tories start before them, they'll be under great pressure to get going.
OK, Nick, thanks very much. Well, for his part, William Hague added to the pressure on Tony Blair. Even before the Prime Minister had spoken, Mr Hague made it clear that a firm date of June the 7th just was not good enough. The Conservatives want the elections postponed until the fight against foot and mouth has been won, which could take months.
The foot and mouth crisis continues to worsen, and of course we now have about 1/3 animals awaiting slaughter, more than 900 cases, and clearly this crisis is not under control. We're all waiting to hear what the government thinks that means for the dates of elections, particularly the local elections planned for the 3rd of May. And if, as seems likely and as has been leaked by the government have conceded that elections cannot take place while this crisis continues, then we would accept that. But since they cannot possibly know when the crisis will end, in our view, it would not be possible to set any new precise date for those elections to be held. So while we would accept legislation in principle postponing the elections, we would not be in favour of a new particular date being set for those elections at this moment until the crisis is resolved.
William Hague. Well, joining me now is the Conservative Party Chairman Michael Ancram, who represents a constituency affected by foot and mouth disease. Mr Ancram, would you congratulate the Prime Minister for his statesmanship? He's putting the country before his party.
Well, I'd call it facing up to reality. I think we've been pressing now for some time for him to postpone or to take powers to postpone the local elections, because if you come down to a constituency like mine, which you quite rightly say is affected by foot and mouth, people down there are simply not interested in elections. They're facing a crisis which is affecting their livelihoods. In some cases, it's affecting their whole way of life. They don't see elections as being relevant to that. They want to see this crisis dealt with, and after that crisis is out of the way, they're happy to talk and think about elections. So I think the Prime Minister has realised rather late in the day, because we should have been looking at cancelling local elections a week ago, that this is the reality on the ground, and he's responding to that.
But if you're a confident party and you're confident that you would handle this better than he would, as you've been suggesting over recent weeks, why aren't you pressing him for the earliest possible election so we could all rally round the Conservatives, give you a chance?
Because I do think that when you have a crisis of this sort, you can't actually ask people in an area which is affected like mine is to think about all the issues which arise in an election, because they are thinking about their own lives and their own livelihoods. What we've said about this government is that there's been a lack of urgency in the way they've dealt with this crisis. Too many things we've told them or suggested to them they should do, like bringing in the army, like looking at on-farm burial, like culling immediately when there's a suspicion of infection in a flock. They're coming to these, but they're coming to them so late that by the time they get there, the problem's even worse.
But aren't you just frightened? I mean, we all know what the opinion polls are. We all know you're going to say you disregard them. But the truth is, you're frightened that you will lose an election. You want to put it off till October or beyond that, because perhaps the economy will turn sour and you might win.
We will fight an election whenever the election's called. I was ready to start an election campaign today, and I would have started it with confidence that we were fighting it to win. But you see, what we've seen here is a Prime Minister who's had to face up to reality. Strange statement he made today. He was talking about putting the mechanism in place. So he wasn't tying the actual election date to resolving the foot and mouth crisis, which is what he should have been doing. But the question I have to ask him, if he's now saying I need time to put mechanisms in place to deal with this crisis, what have they been doing for the last 6 weeks?
Let me pick up that point in a slightly different way. If by June we are still in the middle of a foot and mouth crisis, which we probably will be in one way or another, because it lasted 8 months in 1967, your view is what? That we should put off this election, any elections, till October?
We've said you can't really have proper elections when you're dealing with a national crisis which is running out of control. None of us know what's going to happen to this crisis. What we do know, and I think this is behind the Prime Minister's judgment today, is that the crisis is out of control at the moment. It needs to be got a grip of. He very carefully tried to avoid that point in what he said in Downing Street, because he didn't want to tie his hands. But the reality is still going to be there. If in June this crisis is still running out of control, there will be people, and it won't be party politicians like me, it'll be people who are actually affected by this throughout the country, saying you cannot actually handle an election, handle a crisis, you cannot take the decisions which are needed in the face of a crisis if at the same time you're fighting a general election. That's the key.
Mr Ancram, thank you very much for joining us. Well, the Prime Minister made it clear that his decision was, in part, as we've been hearing, prompted by listening to people, farmers and others he met in Scotland, in Cumbria and in other rural areas of England. So what do people in the areas most affected by foot and mouth make of the decision to postpone the elections, as Mr Blair put it, in the national interest?
I don't think he had any option but to call it off, because how can you run an election campaign at the same time deal with what is one of the biggest crises we've faced for decades as a country? because this is going to run and run.
They'd vote anyway if they wanted to vote with the postal, and I don't see why it should have been put off, but as I say, it doesn't matter really.
I think the people in Cumbria have got like a lot on their mind without thinking about who they're going to be voting for at the moment, and it'll most probably give them a better idea of who they want to vote for, depending on how this is resolved.
I think it might just as well have been held.
Why is that?
Because it wouldn't make a scrap of difference if it was held in 4 weeks' time.
Why is that?
Because it'd still be foot and mouth.
Well, they were the views of a few people in Cumbria today, an area that has been particularly hard hit by the foot and mouth crisis. Nick Utting is from the North Cumbria branch of the National Farmers Union and joins us from Carlisle now. Mr. Utting, do you think this is evidence at least that the Prime Minister is prepared to listen to farmers?
I think he most certainly has on many issues, not just in connection with the election. And as far as the election is concerned, as other people have said to you today, in Cumbria we're fighting a war. We're fighting a war against a major disease that's spreading across our county. No one's been thinking about elections for weeks, yet alone now, and I fear that they may well not be thinking about elections, not in the mood for elections, when we get to June either.
So I'm just wondering, though, whether if the disease is rife in June, as you suggested there, and everybody hopes, of course, it's under control by then, but if it is still rife by June, you'd want another postponement, wouldn't you?
Well, yes, I'm not saying it's going to be rife in June. In fact, I dearly hope that we've got in control of it at that particular time. But there will be a lot of problems that will arise from it, a lot of rebuilding to do. It'll take us many months to get on top of the rebuilding process in Cumbria, and until that rebuilding process can be even considered, let alone put underway, no one's going to be interested in elections. But we have no interest in what the Prime Minister might do as far as the election's concerned. We're fighting a disease and we've got to get on and do it.
Just briefly, no elections have been postponed in this way in this country since World War II. However terrible the situation is in Cumbria, this is clearly not a national emergency like that, is it? So do you not think that the Prime Minister might have just bottled out?
Well, I'm not going to comment on that, but yes, it is a national emergency as far as Cumbria is concerned. It is World War III here. We are fighting, and we want everybody throughout the country. And there are some politicians, I'm sure, still not aware of the crisis that we're facing in this county, and of course other parts of the country too.
Nick Utting, thanks very much for joining us from Cumbria. This is a BBC News special report on the timing of the local elections. So what does all this mean for the timing of the general election? The announcement that the local elections on May the 3rd will be delayed until June requires emergency legislation. May the 14th is the latest the Prime Minister can dissolve Parliament for a June the 7th general election. Although the Labour Party would be against delaying any further than that, the Prime Minister, in theory, doesn't have to call a general election until May the 30th, 2002. Well, Bob Worcester is the chairman of the polling organisation Laurie. Bob, what difference does this make? I mean, how salient is this when he calls an election, whether it's May, June or October?
Well, there are some runes to be examined, one of which is economic optimism. We've had the biggest one-month fall in economic optimism in the period between the onset of the foot-and-mouth crisis on the 20th of February and toward the end of March. We had a 27-point drop in economic optimism. And yet the voting intention figures didn't change at all. So I think in the short term, it's not going to make much difference. But the Prime Minister, indeed, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer especially, will be very conscious that the American economy going south, the impact on tourism and farming exports in this country, the situation in Japan, will all converge around causing the British public to become a little frit, to use Lady Thatcher's expression, with the idea of the economy. And it's the economy stupid is not far off the mind of prime ministers and chancellors and indeed presidents of the United States when facing general elections.
Bob, do you think actually postponing itself is a popular move? I mean, we've seen the polls have suggested a lot of people would like him to do that. Do you think that makes him look prime minister of the entire country, one nation?
I think I probably asked the wrong question. If I said to them, as I did, in the poll that you saw in the Sunday Telegraph yesterday, you saw that by about 2 to 1, the people say, yes, postpone it. But if I'd asked them instead if they would rather have a 4-week campaign or a 10-week campaign, I think I know what the answer would have been. They would have said, let's get it over with and get it out of the way.
Briefly, Bob, on that point, apathy is still Labour's biggest worry. If we think it's a 10-week campaign as a nation, we're going to go off this idea.
It's not so much apathy as irritation. It's don't vote for them, it only encourages them. It's that kind of attitude that I think the Labour Party particularly have to worry about.
Okay, Bob Worcester from Morey, thanks very much. Well, the Prime Minister is, of course, gambling that the foot and mouth crisis won't get any worse. Our correspondent Kevin Bouquet is at Great Orton in Cumbria, where thousands of carcasses are being buried. Kevin, you're in touch with the mood of the farmers up there. We've heard one farmers leader from Cumbria talking about it, saying he's just not thinking about a general election now. What do you think the impact of this decision will be?
Well, I think as far as the farmers are concerned, it is the right decision. They've been arguing for this all along. You remember that going back a couple of weeks, their great complaint was that nobody in the government was taking them seriously, that nobody realised what a crisis this was. Well, I think this decision today is finally the acknowledgement that the farmers in Cumbria are looking for, that the government now knows it is a crisis and that 100% of effort is going into fighting this epidemic. So I think as far as the farming community here is concerned, this is the right decision. They didn't want an election in May and they're not going to have one.
Briefly, Kevin, how confident can we be that this will indeed be under control by June the 7th, if that's when we are to have a general election?
Well, clearly Tony Blair is pinning a lot of hopes on that. And I think the signs are that there is some guarded optimism. The army are being as cautious as ever, but I was talking to one senior officer this morning, and he seemed a lot more upbeat than he was last week. They're on target for 20,000 carcasses a day disposal on this site behind me. I think certainly another month, and we certainly won't see the sort of scenes we're seeing now of dead carcasses lying at farm entrances by the side of the road. I think that will be a memory by then. I think that in the public perception, I suspect that people will feel that a corner has been turned and that they are getting to grips with it.
Kevin, thanks very much. Well, here on this BBC News 24 special report, I'm joined now for the government's view by the Northern Ireland Secretary, Dr. John Reid. Good afternoon to you, Dr. Reid.
Good afternoon,
if there's still a serious problem with foot and mouth come the time the Prime Minister has to decide about a June the 7th general election, should he postpone it again?
Well, I think the Prime Minister has made the reasons clear, sensitivity towards those in the farming community who've been so tragically hit, and also allowing people, national and locally, to focus on the present crisis. But he also made clear that we're balancing this with the concerns of the wider economy, with tourism and so on, and therefore we don't want an indefinite postponement. And I think they've got the balance just about right, and the fact that the head of the Southwest Tourism Organisation, as well indeed as the leader of the Tories in Hampshire and the farmers, all saying this is the right decision. I think that's right. Go for it on the 7th of June.
Appreciate it's a balance, but if you're a farmer and you're faced with the same problems in a month's time, you're still not going to care. The problems in Cumbria are still going to be the same. The logistics, as the Prime Minister said, we can get people to vote, but it wouldn't be right to ask them to do so. Still be true, wouldn't it, in a month's time?
Well, I think the balance is between recognising the sensitivities in the farming and the agricultural side and allowing us to focus on them, but at the same time putting in perspective that we have a wider economy as well as the democratic institutions and processes of the country, and I don't think people would want to see those postponed indefinitely. The only person who's really calling for that is William Hague, who's saying he wants to wait until the crisis, as he calls it, is over. And I think most people know that the crisis he's talking about is the crisis in the Tory party, and if we're waiting for that to be resolved, we could be here for years to come.
How worried are you about the question of apathy? You heard Bob Worcester suggest that if he'd asked a slightly different question, would you like a 10-week election campaign? People, of course, would say no, and that is probably what we're going to have.
Well, I think the question of apathy should worry all politicians, and certainly it is a concern that people think that the Conservative opposition, when it comes to a general election, whenever that may be, are so incapable of forming a government that they may not come out to vote. But I think that will be countered, and in the meantime, all of our attention should be on trying to focus on the foot and mouth disease rather than on the issues of a general election. When that comes along, people will choose between investment in a stable economy which the government's produced and cutbacks in services and the boom and bust of the Tory party.
Dr. Reid, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, both the Scottish and Welsh nationalists had demanded a delay, and this was their reaction a short time ago.
Well, no elections have been postponed here in Scotland. We never had any polls coming forward, and I think what would be wrong is for the Prime Minister to bounce the people of Scotland into a general election at a time that's coincident with the English council elections just because he wants to delay them for a period. He's got to get the foot and mouth issue under control and make sure that the election timing is dependent on solving that problem rather than on addressing the interests of the Labour Party.
Any decision to delay the election shouldn't be done on narrow party political grounds. It should be done in the interests of everybody concerned, all those people affected by foot and mouth. And I know full well that people would be appalled if they felt that people were putting the general election before the interests of our rural communities. I represent a rural community. I know how people feel about this. And therefore my appeal to the Prime Minister is not to name the date of the general election until this disease is under control.
Reaction from the nationalist parties. But what sort of message does a postponement send out to visitors at home and abroad? Well, Sir William Lawrence is the chairman of the Heart of England Tourist Board. Good afternoon to you, Sir William. Isn't this going to send out precisely the message that the Prime Minister suggested a couple of weeks ago, which is namely that Britain is closed for business?
Well, Britain certainly isn't closed to business. There may be a feeling overseas, particularly in America, that there is a problem over here with people coming with the images they see on television and such like. But a lot of the countryside actually is open. And here today in Broadway, you know, set in the lovely rural scene of Worcestershire, there are plenty of things open around for people to come and visit.
True, Sir William, but if you say to Americans, look, we've not done this since World War II, why would an American come to this country under these conditions?
I think it's going to be very difficult to get the Americans to come back over to Britain. They are, you know, noticeably people who keep away from things when there is trouble and they hear about it. But I mean, what we must do first of all is to build the confidence back in our own people, the British people, to come and visit places and actually start using tourism destinations and restaurants and pubs and such like, and actually build the confidence back in this country that Britain is very much still open for business. And then hopefully that will then feed out overseas, particularly to the American market.
Now, the Prime Minister, as you heard, talked about a balance, in effect. He had to weigh up a lot of things, the interest of the farmers, the interest of the country as a whole, the interest of the tourist industry. If he had done what the Conservatives are suggesting, namely had indefinitely postponed these elections, or perhaps talked about October, the autumn sometime, what kind of damage would that have done?
I think that the tourism business as a whole is not really interested in the politics of all of this. I mean, first of all the businesses that I represent are most certainly keen on making sure that the incident of this tragic disease is actually eliminated as soon as possible. That will then mean that obviously it's good news then for the farmers, then it will obviously be good news for the farming businesses and agricultural businesses that have a big impact on tourism. And that's the main thing that we need to see about this. Hopefully we have a responsible government that will make the decisions as to the dates of elections, and that will actually come out of this. But at the present time, I think it would be good to say that by postponing the local elections, at least it will keep unnecessary people wandering up and down to people's farm houses and such like and trying to get votes.
Sir William, thanks very much for joining us from Broadway. Well, Ming Campbell from the Liberal Democrats joins us now from the House of Commons. Mr Campbell, presumably you think this is a reasonably sensible compromise?
Well, I think the Prime Minister had to balance the competing interests that we've just heard about in the last 10 or 15 minutes on your programme. There's no doubt to say we can't have elections does send a very strong signal that there's a crisis of some kind going on. But equally, the Prime Minister, having been, I think, last week to meet farmers, and according to some reports, met farmers with tears in their eyes, obviously felt that it would be inappropriate to proceed with the county council elections and therefore by implication with the general election as well. It's a very fine balance, but he came down, in my view, on the right side of it.
But let me put to you the point I just put to Sir William Lawrence of the Heart of England Tourist Board, which is we haven't done this since World War II. This is clearly a serious moment for many people in this country, but it's not by any stretch of the imagination an emergency like that. And if you're sitting in America trying to figure out whether you should come to any part of Britain for your holiday, you might think that we're panicking.
Well, the difference between now and World War II, of course, is that communication is instantaneous. And therefore people see very directly, very quickly, they see through programmes like yours and many other programmes, precisely what is happening here. And until these people are satisfied in their own minds that some semblance of normality has been restored in the United Kingdom, then they're certainly not going to come as tourists or indeed for any other purpose. That's why it's so important that we get on top of this disease. Now, there's no doubt the Prime Minister's taken a bit of a risk, because I think he's boxed in the sense that he's going to have an election on the first Thursday of June, come what may. He must have had some advice, scientific advice, that they can appear to be doing very much better by then, not least, for example, in making sure that from the point of diagnosis to the point of slaughter, no more than 24 hours elapses. The chief scientific officer has said if you can get that in place, then you begin to make very considerable inroads into the disease.
Mingus Campbell, thanks very much for joining us from the lobby there in Westminster. Now, no Prime Minister is any more sensitive to what the press writes, what the headlines are going to be tomorrow. I'm joined by two distinguished journalists. Trevor Kavanagh is the political editor of The Sun, and Quentin Letts is the sketch writer on the Daily Mail. Trevor Kavanagh, first, what do you make of all this? Is he Is he frightened?
Well, I think that he had to make what John Prescott calls a judgment, and I think that he has taken a gamble, as we said in the Sun on Saturday. There's no doubt that many people in the tourist industry are in some considerable anguish over the way that the orders for bookings, for facilities and air travel to Britain in the next few months have been drastically cut. So it is a gamble. We'll have to see whether that very lucrative industry is going to be badly hit. But he had to make a decision on the basis of how things are showing in the country at large. And I think that perhaps he's made the right one. We'll know when the election takes place.
OK, Quentin Letts in studio. What do you make of it?
Well, in about 10 minutes, we're going to have Jack Straw up in the House of Commons at the dispatch box. Completely the wrong geezer. He doesn't, he's not very enthusiastic about this idea. And it was really the spin doctors who came to this decision, along, strangely enough, with the bishops of the Church of England, and I think the Tories and the Tory press. And so it's a really good illustration, I think, of the way that the Blair machine works. It's always the decisions, really, the big decisions, taken by the spin doctors, by Angie Hunter, by Peter Mandelson, and by the pollsters.
But wouldn't you have said he's arrogant if he hadn't done this? Turn around the other way. You would have called him arrogant for not listening to the country, wouldn't you?
I would have done. I think he's right to do this. That's not to say that the Labour Party in Parliament thinks that. And it's going to be fun in Parliament today to see them all there with very, very waxy smiles on their faces.
Trevor Kavanagh, in a word, the Sun's still going to support Tony Blair whenever the election is.
Yes, and I think that whenever the election is, I think that Tony Blair will win it. The big question is how much is going to happen in the next 10 weeks, which is completely unforeseeable. As we've seen, there's been a huge and unexpected disease affecting farms, which has thrown everything off course.
Trevor and Quentin, there we'll have to leave you. Thanks very much. Because in a few minutes' time, the Home Secretary will get to his feet formally to tell MPs that the elections are being delayed. This is the scene right now inside the House of Commons. BBC News 24 will have live coverage of that statement from 3:30 on the day Tony Blair ended the speculation and postponed polling day. From me, Gavin Essler, from this special report, goodbye.
Having carefully weighed all the arguments, I've decided that the national interest is best served by postponing these elections until June the 7th. Later today, Jack Straw will make a statement to Parliament on the necessary legislation and its details. In reaching this decision, the three most important factors have been these. First, the impact that any delay and the signal it sends has on our tourism industry, and the key national interest in avoiding unnecessary uncertainty for the broader economy. Secondly, the need for national and in some cases local politicians to be focused on the fight against foot and mouth disease as we put in place the machinery necessary to deal with any eventuality. And thirdly, the feelings and sensitivities of the people in the communities most affected.